Hey everybody, today I'm going to go back to my philosophy roots and talk about a subject related to Christian philosophy or theology, and that is the idea of substance dualism. Substance dualism is the view that the mind and body are two distinct substances. The mind is seen as being an immaterial entity, often referred to as the soul, which is not reliant on the brain for existence. And dualism, this type of dualism, has been prevalent in Egyptian, Greek, Jewish, and Hindu cultures, and has been the primary view of the mind throughout Christian history. Now, despite dualism's long history, it has been a lightning rod of criticism within the philosophical community. And many of you might already be familiar with the famous interaction problem, which objects to dualism due to perceived interactions between the mind and body. In this video, I will give an in-depth discussion of responses to this interaction problem. This will include looking at three arguments from causal interaction, which I will call the generic interaction problem, the argument from the principle of energy conservation, and the causal pairing argument. So let's get started with that first one, the generic interaction problem. The proponent of the generic interaction problem objects to dualism by noting how different the immaterial soul is from the material body. The difference between these two is so vast that it is difficult to see how they could possibly interact. Material things seem to move when a force is acted upon them or when a certain chemical reaction occurs. As Churchland puts it, quote, "How is this utterly insubstantial thinking substance have any influence on ponderous matter? How can two such things be in any sort of causal contact?" This objection to dualism fails for several reasons. First, Craig and Moreland note that the proponent of the interaction problem assumes that if we do not know how two things causally interact, then we are unjustified in believing that those two objects interact. However, this is clearly wrong. If we have good reasons to think A causally interacts with B, and that A and B are material and immaterial respectively, then we are justified in these beliefs even if we can't explain how A and B interact. The lack of causal explanation does not serve as a defeater for the prior two beliefs. Craig and Moreland also note that there is a more fundamental issue with the interaction problem stated in this way, which is that the question, how does A cause B, implies a mechanistic explanation for A causing B. However, the dualist would respond to this by noting that there likely is no how for A and B, as their interaction is a form of basic causation devoid of any underlying mechanism. The physicalists cannot turn their nose up at this response because at some point they are also forced to acknowledge some type of non-mechanistic causation. To illustrate this, take the physical interaction of striking a match causing a flame to appear. This causal chain can be explained in terms of chemical reactions. However, we might ask what the causal mechanism is for those chemical reactions. This would lead us to talking about atoms and electrons. However, now the interaction of those atoms need to be explained, which leads us to quarks and so on and so forth. Eventually, unless one embraces an infinite regress, one gets to the point at which there are no more underlying mechanisms. Therefore, the dualist is no worse for wear in saying that the causal interaction between mind and body is basic and non-mechanistic, because we all have to say that there's this type of basic causation at some point. Now, Jose Rodriguez argues along similar lines by noting that lacking a causal theory for the mind and body is not a sufficient defeater for dualism, because we also lack a clear causal theory for causation simpliciter. Rodriguez notes that under the most prominent philosophical theories of causation, dualism will have no issue in dealing with causation between the mind and body. Under a counterfactual theory of causation, A causes B if the absence of A entails the absence of B. Under covering law theories, A causes B if there is a general law that connects the presence of A to the presence of B. Under probability raising theories, A causes B if the presence of A raises the probability of B occurring. Finally, primitivist theories say that A causing B is an unanalyzable relationship, and dualism is safe and secure under each of these theories of causation. There doesn't seem to be anything problematic with saying that some physical states would not occur in the absence of some mental states, that there is a general law which connects mental states to physical states, or that the presence of a mental state, say being thirsty, will raise the probability of some physical state, getting a drink, or we're just saying that causation between mind and body is primitive and unable to be analyzed. So with this out of the way, let's move on to the more sophisticated version of this, which is the argument from the principle of energy conservation. So closely related to the generic interaction problem is the objection that dualism violates the law of conservation of energy. John Searle expresses this objection saying, quote, "Physics says the amount of matter/energy in the universe is constant, but substance dualism seems to imply that there is another kind of energy, mental energy or spiritual energy, that is not fixed by physics. So, if If substance dualism is true, then it seems one of the most fundamental laws of physics, the law of conservation, must be false, end quote. Craig and Moreland respond to this objection by noting several issues. First, the principle of energy conservation says that energy in a closed system will not increase or decrease. The dualists will happily affirm this principle and remind the objector that dualists don't think the physical world is a closed system. Craig and Moreland argued that if mental causation brings energy into the physical world, it may be an insignificant amount. They provide an analogy of a large dam holding back tons of water, which is then opened by the pressing of a button on a terminal. The pressing of the button is an extremely small use of energy when compared to the larger effect, and the interaction of the mind and the physical world might be analogous to the opening of the dam. If this is the case, the increase in energy may be so small that we cannot detect it. However, Robin Collins responds to the energy conservation objection by arguing that modern physics provides cases in which the principle of energy conservation does not apply. Collins uses gravitational fields and general relativity as an example, as the energy in gravitational fields can't be defined. Physicist Robert Wald expresses this by saying, quote, "In general relativity, there exists no meaningful local expression for gravitational stress energy, and thus there is no meaningful local energy conservation law which leads to a statement of energy conservation," end quote. This is problematic for the objector to dualism, as gravitational fields have causes. They have causal effects on material objects, and these effects can raise or decrease the amount of non-gravitational energy within a system. Gravitational waves affect the energy content of matter, but this increase in energy can't be expressed as a transfer of energy from the gravitational waves. Thus, in an enclosed section of space, the amount of energy could increase or decrease without any energy passing through the barrier of the region. Karl Hoffer has remarked that, quote, "Energy gain in a gravity wave detector could be thought of as a genuine gain without having to say that the energy existed somewhere beforehand," end quote. Collins notes that this feature of general relativity has been used in inflationary cosmology to explain how the energy in the universe came from such a small region of pre-space. This means that one of the most prominent cosmological theories recognizes and exploits general relativity's allowance of non-conservation of energy. The claim of the objector that the principle of energy conservation is a fundamental and central aspect of science is therefore mistaken. Karl Hofer notes that this exalted idea of the principle of energy conservation was, quote, "arguably fairly short-lived, limited to part of the 19th and early 20th centuries, and at all time fraught with difficulties," end quote. In addition to attacking the principle of energy conservation, Collins argues against the assumption that any physical interaction entails an exchange of energy. Collins notes that in Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen correlations, two different particles separated by a wide spatial distance are correlated in law-like ways, and that this correlation cannot be explained by a non-instantaneous common cause. Causal events on particle A affect particle B, despite the fact that an energy transfer from A to B would have to be faster than the speed of light, which is not possible under special relativity. These law-like correlations seem to show causation with no energy transfer and no intermediate carrier between A and B. Collins offers two positions regarding the EPR correlations. First, one can be a causal realist and affirm that A and B are linked in some form of instantaneous causation. Second, one can be a causal anti-realist, which denies a causal link between A and B, but affirms that there is a law-like connection between the correlations of A and B. And Collins argues that either option is acceptable for the dualist defense. If causal realism is adopted, the dualist can ask why a mind-brain interaction must involve an energy exchange when EPR correlations do not. If the causal anti-realist position is adopted, the dualist could hold to the position that there is a law-like correlation between mental states and physical states. Now, physicist and philosopher J.B. Pitts takes issues with both the physicalist objection from energy conservation that we saw from John Searle, but also with popular dualist responses. Pitts argues that both sides are operating under an understanding of energy laws which doesn't reflect developments in modern physics. In modern physics, conservation laws are taken to be local and conditional. Pitts believes the typical objection from energy conservation is question-begging, as it fails to reflect an understanding of Noether's first theorem, which connects conservation laws to symmetries. The contraposition of Noether's theorem is that non-symmetries entail non-conservation. Because an immaterial mind affecting a material world would be an instance of non-symmetry, there would be non-conservation. So Pitt thinks the proper response for the dualist in the face of this type of objection objection is to just say, yeah, so what? Pitts is not, however, sympathetic to Collins' use of general relativity to argue for immaterial-material interaction. Despite disagreeing with Collins, Pitts respects the sophistication and rhetorical power of Collins' argument. Pitts remarks, quote, "The Morhoff-Collins invocation of general relativity is doubtless a rhetorically impressive move. By knowing much more physics than usual, one supposedly shows that the usual, supposedly scientific objection fails. Surprisingly, to those outside the field of general relativity, it is unusual to take the formal conservation laws and gravitational energy seriously in general relativity. The Morhoff-Collins proposal takes that widely shared idea in the general relativity literature and exploits it for the philosophy of mind. Generally, there is something of an anti-realist tendency regarding energy conservation in general relativity, at least regarding the local conservation laws, the kind that elsewhere modern physics usually employs." End quote. Now, Pitt's qualms with Collins' argument largely stems from a controversial debate regarding pseudotensors and realism about gravitational energy localization. Pitt thinks the arguments against pseudotensors are problematic as they assume that there cannot be an infinite of energies. An entailment of Pitt's position is that energy is in fact conserved within a general relativity. Pitt states, quote, "Taking gravitational energy seriously, as I do, would be an asset for conserved quantity theories of causation. Mine is, however, thus far a minority view," end quote. Weighing in on the debate of how seriously one should take the gravitational energy localization is above the academic pay grade that I have, right? But it is enough for the dualist to know that there's serious controversy over whether energy is conserved in general relativity. The fact that this controversy exists and that the majority view is in favor of non-conservation defeats the accusation that dualism is untenable on the ground that it permits energy non-conservation. If physicists do not seem too bothered that their theory permits energy non-conservation, why should the dualists be bothered about potential energy non-conservation? Now let's turn to causal pairing. Jaegwon Kim presents an argument against dualism that questions the causal pairing between the soul and the body. Imagine two spatially separated guns, A and B, which are fired at two different people, Adam and Bob, respectively. What is it that makes gun A cause Adam's death and not Bob's death? Kim argues that ultimately, regardless of how we cash this out, the answer lies in a spatial relationship between the guns and as they relate to Adam and Bob. And so this question can be turned to causation among souls. Suppose that immaterial souls A and B have the same mental state, and that one of these mental states brings about some material state M. How can we say that A causes M but B does not? Both souls have the same mental state, and neither has a different spatial relationship to M. Kim argues from this thought experiment that non-spatial entities cannot stand in causal relationships to physical entities because they lack spatial relations. Now, Rodriguez notes that in making this argument, Kim assumes that merely numerical difference cannot ground differences in causal relationships. The implication of this is that two qualitatively identical but numerically different objects cannot have different causal relationships. Rodriguez notes that any proponent of libertarian freedom will reject this assumption as a non-starter. Proponents of libertarian freedom would affirm that two otherwise identical agents could bring about differing states of affairs. Tim could walk down a garden path and decide to take a left, while Tom walks down the same path and chooses to take a right. Rodriguez also notes that there are cases outside of libertarian freedom which serve as counterexamples for Kim's assumption. Consider the following case. Assume a universe of three objects, A, B, and C. Object A is 2 meters away from object B, and object C is 2 meters away from B in the opposite symmetrical direction. Object A and C share all their non-Hasidious properties, except their spatial location. Either of the two objects has a 2% chance of causing an object to crack when they are 2 meters away from it. B cracks. Most likely, either only A did it or only C did it. How to decide? We can't appeal to their different spatial locations, since they are at the same distance of the relevant object. So it seems we have to accept that their bare numerical difference is responsible for one of them having had a causal impact while the other didn't. End quote. If mere numerical identity is sufficient grounds for distinguishing between causal relationships, well then the dualist is untroubled. The dualist can maintain that soul A causes state M while soul B does not, because soul A is numerically identical to the cause of M while B is not. In a similar vein, one response to Kim's argument is to deny that causal pairing supervenes on non-causal states. Bennett has expressed this objection by noting that the dualist may just hold causation to be primitive. A is causally paired with M because A causes M, and that's the end of the story. Bennett notes that Kim's argument is not an argument against dualism so much as it is an argument for why dualists are committed to causal anti-reductionism. Causal anti-reductionism is usually held for reasons not pertaining to dualism. So the dualist isn't invoking causal anti-reductionism in an ad hoc manner. Alvin Plantinga also questions the assumption that causal pairings have some factor which connects A and event M. Plantinga invites us to consider the question of identity over time. What makes it the case that object P at time t is identical to some object P star at a future time t star? One can note necessary conditions for identity over time, but these do not explain what makes it the case that P is again identical to P star. It seems like the answer may very well be that there is no other factor which determines identity. If this is the case, why can't causation be the same? A final failure of Kim's causal pairing argument, noted by Bailey, Rasmussen, and Van Horen, is that it's only effective against non-spatial forms of dualism. The dualist can maintain that the soul occupies a region of space, but is not material or physical. Soul A causes an event in body B because soul A occupies the same region of space as body B, while other souls do not. Souls therefore stand in spatial relations, which allows them to meet Kim's standard for causal pairing. In defense of this possibility, Bailey et al. Note that Kim's objections against spatially located souls are unsuccessful. It cannot be objected that spatial dualism is just a weird form of physicalism, as there is nothing about spatial location which entails material composition. Spatial dualism cannot be rejected because of the absurdity of the soul being a geometric point, as the dualist does not have to maintain that the soul is simply a geometric point. Finally, Kim objects to spatial dualism from the possible co-location of souls. This objection fails because the dualist can hold to an impenetrability principle, which states that two souls can't occupy the same space. Even if two souls can occupy the same space, it still does not seem problematic for the dualist. Suppose that two souls overlap in a body, and the body raises its right hand. We can say that soul A causes the hand to rise because soul A intended it, while soul B did not. If it is the case that both soul A and soul B intended to raise the hand, then this is just a generic case of overdetermination comparable to two bullets piercing a man's skull at the same time. Alright, so this video has analyzed 3 lines of arguments against substance dualism from causal interaction and shown them all to be flawed. Merely lacking a causal explanation for mental causation is not problematic, as the causal interactions may just be basic. The argument from the principle of energy conservation is flawed in that it assumes the principle of energy conservation must apply in every scenario and assumes that causal interaction requires energy transfer. Final, causal pairing arguments are flawed in that they assume numerical differences cannot explain causal interactions and that it is impossible for souls to have a property which links them to only one body. Causal pairing arguments are also only applicable to non-spatial forms of dualism. Regarding arguments from causal interaction, we can therefore conclude that dualism emerges bloodied but unbowed.